Hello again, YouTube. Jason here again, and what we're going to talk about today is replacing the blown fuse in a Generation 2 Sega CD system. And a good indication that you have a blown fuse is that the CD system won't power on at all. The fuses on these are prone to blowing, and what causes that a lot of times is using the improper AC adapter. So if you take a look at the back here, you'll notice that there's a spot for an AC adapter on your Genesis and a separate spot on your Sega CD. Okay, these are two different AC adapters. So I'll kind of go over that right now with you. What you need to run your Sega CD is a 9-volt 1.2 amp AC to DC adapter with a center negative, and that's the big thing, is most of your AC adapters have a center positive and the outside is negative. So a lot of people will plug one of those in, you know, the voltage is right, the amps are right, and they'll blow that fuse. Okay, so a little trick is that the Sega CD will use the same AC adapter as a Model 1 Genesis. Okay, but your 32X, which was the system that would plug in here, would run its own AC adapter as well, and that would run the same AC adapter as a Model 2 Genesis. So you can't just use the same AC adapter for all three. Okay, and I highly suggest that you find one that works and you have a dedicated one for each, your Genesis and your Sega CD, because if you don't have both of these plugged in, you're not going to get anything. Okay, so without further ado, what we're going to do is we're going to look real quick at the tools we're going to need. Phillips screwdriver. I highly suggest a little magnetic bowl in which to put your screws so you're not losing them. A flat workspace, maybe with a cushion top. I've just got a old bed sheet here. Cup of coffee. And the fuses, which we'll cover shortly. Right. And then of course, you know, solder, soldering iron, things like that. I've actually repaired the one in here, so I'm just going to open it up and show you. And please don't poke fun at my soldering job. It is pretty basic. But here we go. So flip your Genesis over, and what you're going to do is there should be two screws holding the bracket in place. Remove the two screws in the bowl with them. Then this little corner piece should just slide right off, and you can set this aside. Flip your Genesis and Sega CD combo back over and slide the Genesis to the left. Okay, and you'll notice the other bracket is on there, and we don't need to mess with this. We're done with the Genesis for now. So put your Genesis aside and flip your Sega CD back over. And you'll find screws 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, 6. Not all these little indentations have screws in them. These three should not. So you're going to remove these 6 screws. Alright, that one doesn't want to come out. That's not a big deal. It's loose. It's just not coming out. Try to refrain from throwing your tools. Try to refrain from stripping your screws. Another stubborn one there. Okay, now once all the screws are removed, go ahead and set your Sega CD back upright and just pull the top away. That simple. Alright, set the top away for future replacement. Now the next thing that you're going to do is you'll see this great big metal shield that's in the way, and this is to prevent, RF interference. So this has 1, 2, 3, 4 screws, with this one over here being a ground screw as well. And I'll try to tilt that enough so you can see. Right there. Alright. Now you're going to want to be careful. There's nothing holding your laser assembly in. It is just rubber mounted like the engine in a car. So you don't want to go flipping this upside down anymore because you will probably drop that. And it may yank on the wires and it may rip something, and you don't want to deal with that. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. 5 screws. And carefully pull the shield away, and you may notice there's a couple of tabs right here that are kind of holding it back. So gently move those out of the way. Do not bend those. You could break them off. This whole thing is pretty thin metal and prone to bending or breaking. Alright, and now you'll see my ugly solder job. So set the shield aside. Make sure you've removed all screws. If you're going to tip it, like I said, hold the CD drive in place. Alright, so right here underneath this tape is what we're looking at, and I have tape there so that, if this moves around at all, it's not short-circuiting. Okay, so what you're looking at, what you're looking for is right here is a little block marked F301, and typically what you'll find in there is a little green, almost looks like a resistor. Okay, but it's not a resistor, it's a fuse. It's a little glass fuse, and if you crush it, if you squeeze it with a pair of pliers, it will break. Okay, so what you're going to want to do is desolder from the 2 contact points here in F301. You're going to want to desolder the old fuse and pull it out. You can either use a specialty desoldering iron or desoldering gun, or however you want to call it, or you can just melt the old solder with your soldering iron and pull it away. Be careful not to pry on anything, be careful not to bend anything. Everything in here, is old and will break. Once you have pulled that away, you're going to want to replace with a new fuse. So let's talk about that real quick. The fuse that's in there is a 2.5 amp 125 volt fast acting pico fuse. Okay, that is extremely difficult to find unless you feel like mucking about online and ordering them online. I found a pretty decent electronics store here in Temecula, where I live, California, and they had fuses. They didn't have the picos. They had full-size fuses, which is not a problem. All right, here's what I've replaced with, is a full-size fuse. Okay, so what you want to keep in mind is that 2.5 amp. That's the important thing. You want to replace a 2.5 amp fuse with a 2.5 amp fuse. Now, they didn't have 125 volt fuses, they had 250 volt fuses. And you can see right there on the back. Okay, now a thing to keep in mind, especially if you live here in America, because I'm pretty sure the voltage would be different if you lived elsewhere. Here in America, pretty much everything runs off of 125 or 120 volt, 125 volt. However, you can replace your fuse with a 250 volt fuse. The voltage doesn't really matter. You're not gonna damage anything by putting a 250 in. Okay, because everything in America, except for our appliances, is running off of 120 volt or 125 volt. You're never going to push 250 volts through here, so you don't have to worry about it. So in a pinch, if you can't, like I couldn't, locate the exact proper amperage fuse with the proper voltage fuse, you can always increase the voltage, but you can't decrease the voltage. You couldn't run, if you needed a 250 volt fuse, you can't run a 125 volt fuse. Okay, so that's your simple electronics lesson for the day. You can always go higher in voltage, you can't go lower. Now, of course, if I were to plug this in, somehow get this plugged into a 240 outlet, it would probably make my Sega CD burst into flames. Alright, I kid, it wouldn't make it burst into flames. However, it would cause serious internal damage because now it's not, now that fuse isn't watching the voltage so much. Alright, so resolder the fuse, and you saw the legs on this were extremely long, so feel free to clip some of the leg off on either end of these leads here. Alright, just don't damage the center portion, that's the actual fuse. So get it in there, resolder it in on F301, and bend it out of the way as you need. Make sure it's not touching anything metal. And as an added bonus, go ahead and wrap some tape over this sucker. So when you put that heat shield back on, it's not touching. Okay, and yeah, it's ugly, but it is functional. So you'll put your heat shield back on, making sure that you don't damage any wires or anything in the way. If it feels, it should provide a little resistance, but you know, not a whole lot. If it requires a whole lot of resistance, you've probably done something wrong. You might want to take a look. Just make sure that you don't have something in the way. And it should slide right back on there just like so. And again, those little tabs are going to hold it from moving about too much. So let's move this new fuse out of the way. This came as a pack of 5 for like, I think it was like $1.25 or something. So, you know, you'll have extras. And I did muck one up putting it in. I bent the leads in a completely weird manner and it didn't fit. So this is actually the second fuse I put in. So that means I have 3 more as these blow. Okay, so put the heat shield back on with the 5 screws. Back into place. A magnetic screwdriver would help here. I'm just too lazy to dig mine back out. Remember that this one here, closest to the drive, serves as a ground as well. So make sure that that ground wire is, make sure the screw is through the ground wire and then back in where it goes here. There we are, 5 screws. Next you're going to replace the top. And flip it back over. And start putting these screws back where they go. Okay, and once you have those 6 screws back where they belong, you can slide your Genesis back on, and you'll notice the bottom has these little hooks, and they're going to want to hook right into these little slots here. So set it right in the slots and slide it back together. It should make a pretty positive clicking sound like that. Flip it back over one last time. Same here. Slide that right back on there. 2 screws. And you are back together. Pretty quick and painless. Now, as with anything, you're going to want to check your work and make sure that this thing turns on now. Okay, so I'm going to move this back over here to the TV. And again, sorry for the glare. As I've told you before, my game center is in my garage. Alright, and I'm probably going to cross the shot here a couple times while I'm plugging all this in. And I'm in my pajamas today. I haven't bothered to get out of them because I've had this week off from work and I get to do that. So I have not really gotten out of pajamas for much this week. Make sure you have both adapters in where they go. Get yourself a disc. Pop it in your Sega CD. Okay, something I want to cover here is you need to make sure that you don't have a Genesis cartridge in when you're trying to play Sega CD, because the Genesis will always default to the Genesis if there's a Genesis cart in there, if that makes any sense to you. So if you're trying to play Sega CD, take any cartridge out of the Genesis, is what I'm trying to say. Alright, so same switch on the Genesis. Boom. Okay, and what you're gonna see is you see the light for the Genesis is solid and the light for the Sega CD is blinking. Everything works. Cool. Alright, everything works beautifully. Switch the Genesis back off. Okay, and last thing I want to cover is a good way to prevent the fuse from blowing is when you're not using the Sega CD, unplug it. Unplug the adapter. Alright. It's nothing for you to plug it back in next time you want to play. Because these fuses blow out a lot, that's just one preventive measure that you can take. And that's pretty much it. That covers how to replace the blown fuse in your Sega CD and get it to work again. So thank you very much for watching, and check out my other videos for other walkthroughs on other things that you can do.